Warriors are not born. Warriors are forged in the crucible of adversity. Warriors without fear are warriors without courage. We are men destroying stigma and stereotypes. We are a band of brothers because in brotherhood there is strength. Our weapons are strength, empathy, and honesty. We are mental health warriors, and this is our voice.
Sabrina Andrews is a woman who changed my point of view on Cindy and her mental illness and the label of bipolar disorder that she carried to her grave. She helped me see that Cindy's traumatic childhood was really the thread that ran through her entire life, and her behaviors were not mental illness, but they were emotionally driven responses to the trauma she endured. Helping me see that just gave me so much more compassion into what she went through, and it helped me understand it better. And that's why this episode is so important for you to listen to. If you're dealing with mental health issues, or you're supporting loved ones who are dealing with mental health issues, or if you just want a different perspective that will help you look at the world in a more compassionate way, Sabrina will help you do that. We talk about so many interesting things in this episode. We talk about sensitivity and resilience, neurosis versus psychosis, no choice choices, which I think is going to be an incredibly liberating concept for people to understand. So sit back, enjoy, and prepare for your mind to be open, because Sabrina's message is powerful, and I believe it's the way of the future. If you love what we're doing on this podcast, one of the ways you can support us is by leaving us a positive review on iTunes. It would mean a lot to us, and we would really appreciate it. Enjoy this episode and the many episodes to come. They're only going to get better and better and better, and we are so excited to be doing this. Hi, everybody. It's Jason McKenzie. My partner, Brian Noller, is MIA today. I think he's out actually helping people, so I'm going to cut him some slack for not being here. So I'm really, really excited about this podcast because we just did a community call in our Mental Health Warriors group, and it was extremely powerful. And I'm really excited to talk to our guest today and delve into some of this subject matter more. So I have with me today Sabrina Andrews, and I've known her for probably 5 or 6 years. We kind of connected through, I don't remember how we connected actually, but I'm sure you'll remember. But through Cindy, and I remember her speaking at an event that Sabrina had put on, and we've stayed in contact over the years. And just recently I had a really impactful conversation with her that helped me crystallize some of the thoughts I was having just around Cindy and mental illness. And it was an alternative point of view that I think we want to share, and that we don't want to shy away from on this podcast, right? That's our mission, is to talk to thought leaders, to talk to people that are in the depths of struggling, to talk to people that are breaking down stigma, and to offer alternative and maybe sometimes controversial points of view, and to be fearless about doing that. So I want to welcome Sabrina Andrews to our show today. So hi, Sabrina, how are you?
Hi, good. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And I will remind you, so you had put an offer out to the agency I worked for at the time to volunteer. And so you come and volunteer for my family support program, and you did some work, and then ended up doing that speaking event that
that's right. That is right.
So that's how it happened. And it was about 6 years ago. So.
Yeah, no kidding. So
yeah.
Sabrina, we both live in London, Ontario, and just to give you a little bit of inside baseball here, I'm actually in my basement, and Sabrina's in my wife's much nicer office. So we treat our guests well here on the Mental Health Warriors podcast. And so Sabrina's a mental health coach, and she's also got a very long, awesome sounding designation that I'm going to get her to say because I can't remember it right now. So go.
Right. So the acronym is CPRP. So it's Certified Psychiatric Rehabilitation Practitioner.
And what is that?
Well, that's a coach. No, actually what that is it's rehabilitation. So as it connotes, it's rehabilitation in the area of mental and emotional wellness. So rehab being things that a person can do to improve their situation that is outside of sort of what we would see as traditional clinical treatment. So it's working on oneself to improve emotional and mental wellness. And so I like to see myself as a bit of a coach, or a support person in that arena, helping people figure out what they need to do that.
Wonderful. Okay, so how we got talking about the subject we're going to talk about today was, for me, what I have started thinking about. I mean, I think everybody knows it's been 7 years since Cindy's death, and I mean that gives you a ton of time to grow and evolve and learn and reflect on events that have happened and all of that kind of stuff. And I've really started to question, without any actual knowledge, just just sort of intuitively question how she was treated by the medical system, and because I knew that, she had a horrific childhood. She had a mother who was schizophrenic. She had tons of abandonment issues. She was sexually abused. There was, physical violence. There was all kinds of stuff. And I knew that plagued her throughout her life, but nobody ever delved into that or even talked about it when she was diagnosed as bipolar disorder. So in other words, she started exhibiting all of these symptoms, and they were highly destructive and sort of, quote, irrational and dangerous and unpredictable and devastating and all of those things. And so when her family doctor told her she thought she might be bipolar, we went to a psychiatrist, and within 30 minutes, the psychiatrist had diagnosed her as being bipolar without delving into any of the trauma she had experienced as a kid or throughout her life. And she carried that label and the treatment that goes with that label to her grave. So then when I was talking to Sabrina, it really, kind of about this subject, and I had no words or concepts about it other than there had to have been a better way to deal with that. And that's what led us into this really conversation that's really had a huge impact on me, and which is why I want to share it with you today. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that? We can use Cindy as an example as we spin off into other ideas.
Sure, absolutely. And so what happened, and so I just want to kind of describe in the way that I understand that, how that miss, what we now kind of identify as being a miss in her treatment happened. Mm-hmm. Because it's very common, and it's a story that I hear, and not to take away from your experience and your pain, but I mean, it's working with families. It's a story that I hear several times a week. And so we say, how could that have been missed? And what happens is when, we seek out medical treatment for what we believe to be, some mental health issues, and we seek medical treatment, the practitioner or the clinician is looking at it through that medical lens. And so when Cindy, so we'll use that as an example. I would imagine when Cindy talked about what was happening in her life, the clinician, being a doctor, would have looked at that in terms of symptoms. And so what they do is they take the information they're given and try to match it up with their list, their diagnostic manual, mm-hmm. Diagnostic criteria, and they look it up in, they don't have to look it up, I'm exaggerating, but so they match it up with what best fits that list of symptoms to explain it in a medical context. And so really all a diagnosis is, Jason, is one expert's best guess with the information they're provided with. Mm-hmm. But really a doctor is using, they're matching it up with what their best guess is in terms of pathology or illness. So they might have listened to Cindy's story and heard things like, huge mood swings. They probably heard things like huge mood swings, extreme sadness, irrationality, volatility. And so they went through their checklist and decided that most closely matched up with something that they call or know to be bipolar illness. Mm-hmm. And so again, being a clinician or a doctor, well, what do we have? Well, and then history would be, again, using a medical lens. They're not taking trauma history. They're taking family history of pathology. Right. So they hear mother who has schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is sort of closely related in the diagnostic manual to, the mania experience with bipolar. And so they make that link. And then, so what do they have to treat illness? Being a doctor, they have in their toolbox, or what they have is pharmacology. So then they prescribe what they believe to be the appropriate treatment for what they see as illness with her family history. And they probably prescribe a mood stabilizer. So the cocktail, the bipolar cocktail, it's an antidepressant, a mood stabilizer, and a bit of antipsychotic.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, as you said, which breaks my heart, is that lens is what was used for all future treatment. And so that's how the myth happened. And I see it, very, very, very often. So in the call that we did earlier, the community call, I talked about, the prevalence of the kind of, what we call organic or the true diagnosis of bipolar, which only happens in 1% of the population, and yet 20%, everybody I talk to seems to have this diagnosis of bipolar. Well, it isn't. It does not present itself that often. What is happening is people who are in extreme emotional distress and who are having these disproportionate emotional reactions to that and are making not great choices in dealing with their pain, they end up with that label because it's looked at through that medical lens.
So, okay, that's very, very interesting. So as we talked, you proposed an alternative that, maybe an alternative diagnosis or alternative scenario that really, the more I think about it, the more sense it actually makes. So do you want to maybe walk through that for our audience?
Sure. So what you and I talked about is that a lot of times, and so we're talking about bipolar because that in that Cindy's case, that's what she had been diagnosed with. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about bipolar, but really it can apply to many of the things that we call mental illness. So anxiety, we talked about depression, we talked about anxiety, we talked about obsessive compulsive disorder, we talked about mania, some psychosis, some of the psychosis that is maybe shorter in duration. All of those things can be explained in another way, which is a more humanistic lens, or a more of an emotional lens versus that mental health or medical one. So that lens would be more about understanding people's experiences and their vulnerabilities and their personality, and looking at, like, when I say experiences, things that happen to them like trauma, and figuring out how that affects their current thinking and behavior.
Okay, so in Cindy's case, having given some of the background, can we walk through, the events that happened to her as a childhood and how they manifested themselves, ultimately till when she, I'll quote, completely went off the rails or whatever you want to, that's probably not the best term, but because, there was, in her younger life, there was, she was dealt with bulimia, for example. Mm-hmm. And so there was a number of red flags. So maybe we can talk about, how these events as a childhood kind of carry through your life and manifest themselves in these ways later.
Right. So, and that's another, so eating disorders, addiction, self-harming behavior, spending, promiscuity, volatile relationships, dramatic relationships. Those are all, when I say maladaptive coping, those are all things that people use to band-aid their pain, right? Now, it doesn't make sense. And so I don't want to go we won't get too deep into the psychological stuff, but those are what we would call, pain management or coping strategies. Okay. Mm-hmm. So going back, and so again, sort of using Cindy's story as a case study or an example, you see early trauma. So that, and related to attachment. So attachment trauma happens when a young person does not feel safe and secure in their environment. The fact that her mother had a mental illness doesn't mean, and this is where it gets tricky, and some people won't agree with me, and that's okay, because that's just my opinion, right? When doctors say, okay, well, there's a family history of mental illness, so, mom had schizophrenia, so, we're going to call this bipolar. Well, they're not 100% wrong in the sense that there is family history plays a role. And what I think is significant is the fact that if Cindy's mom had a major mental illness and was erratic in her behavior and erratic in her parenting, it's quite possible that because of her disorder, her lack of functioning, she was not able to provide the safe haven, safe-based, predictable environment that a young person needs to thrive. Mm-hmm. So the connection isn't schizophrenia per se in terms of biology. The connection is that her mother did not provide what she needed as a young person to make her feel safe and secure.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that we tend to look at it from through a medical lens as it's hereditary, like biologically hereditary. But what you're saying is that it's kind of passed on through the emotional trauma from a parent to child.
Piece of it. Right. And so now I'm not discounting heredity in biology.
Okay.
So, but the heritable factor is maybe an emotional vulnerability. So, we talked about this the last time, is we're all born different. We're all born with different personalities. We have resiliencies and vulnerabilities, whether or not we have a learning disability or, our capacity for cognition, so our IQ, some of that's predetermined. And emotional, so we would call them empaths, or people who feel deeply, or people who are a little more sensitive. I mean, that can be heritable, right? That can be inherited. For sure. So so it could be a vulnerability that's inherited.
I see.
So in Cindy's case, I think the catalyst for some of her future problems would have been in her early experiences, her mother's inability to parent, to be predictable, to provide that safety and security of self. And how do we know that? We know that because she experienced abuse. We know that she wasn't protected. So then again, looking at those experiences of abuse or neglect that happened, again, that is trauma, and it's also in attachment. So when a small person doesn't feel safe and secure and protected, that is, creates attachment insecurity. So we see example after example. So yeah, she could have inherited an emotional sensitivity or vulnerability from her mother, and then that was, reinforced or, that was made worse. I can't think of the word that I'm looking for right now, but what happened is that got more complicated as she had those very invalidating experiences,
okay.
where she wasn't protected. Exacerbated. That's a good way to look at it. So what it causes is the invalidating experiences or the trauma that she experienced. It causes emotional pain, right? And when we have these experiences one after another that make us feel unloved, unwanted, unprotected, unsafe, we start to internalize that. So it distorts our view of ourselves. So we could be a wonderful, smart, compassionate, productive person, and yet if what we believe about ourselves because of our experiences have taught us that we are unloved, unprotected, unwanted, hurt, that becomes our belief. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So now that distorts or clouds things moving forward. And we start to perceive hurt and pain and rejection even when it's not there. So it's how these individuals who have this attachment trauma or who are insecurely attached in the world always question their place. They always question, am I loved? Am I valued? Am I wanted? Am I needed? So these folks often have very tumultuous relationships. They have sometimes difficulty in interpersonal relationships at work. They have low self-esteem in certain areas. So is that ringing any bells, Jason, when you think about Cindy's situation?
Yeah, it really is. Hey, really quickly.
Yes.
You're moving around a little bit, and it's making your microphone. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I just want to point out. Yeah. So totally. That's exactly how she felt. She felt not good enough. She felt like she would seek out. Like one aspect that she really sought out. She was desperate for father figure type roles in her life, right? Like,
for sure.
Because she never had that, right? So she really glommed onto people, or like it was, if she found someone that was, of a reasonably high character, she put them on this huge, huge pedestal. And oftentimes they would disappoint her, right? So,
and that's, classic characteristic of people who have attachment insecurity. It's black or white thinking. It's also, like you said, it's, you're either all good or all bad. So you're all good until you disappoint, and then it's all bad, right?
Right.
And people have, are more sensitive to disappointment, rejection, hurt, abandonment, all of those things. So I'm just going to move us sort of along. So how do we get to where the wheels go off the bus and things are irrational?
Right.
And so when people carry this emotional pain and this insecurity, then they tend to see it. So, if I feel like people don't respect me, then if I have a situation at work where somebody maybe questions a decision I make, that is a bigger hurt because, well, they don't respect me because we see what we believe to be true, right? So now I have this emotional trigger. So my emotional pain center has been activated because I perceive this, abandonment, rejection that I feel. And I have this huge emotional response. We call it disproportionate emotional response to that trigger. And that's where the wheels go off the bus, because now our amygdala gets activated. And so that's the part in our brain where we store trauma, but it's our fight or flight response. And when that gets activated because we're experiencing some big emotion, we can't think clearly, rationally, logically, because our amygdala sort of hijacked us. And that's where we see people acting irrationally. So it's where people, they have somebody looks at them sideways at work, and all of a sudden it's, they don't like me, they don't respect me, I'm going to lose my job. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And everything is huge. Does that kind of resonate?
It does. So I guess one thing I would like to talk about, because I've heard a lot of people say this, and it was true in my case, is that, and before I actually say this, we'll get into this because you talked about this at the beginning, but this is not specific behavior to people that are labeled as bipolar, right? So we'll talk about that shortly. But one of the things that people at, say, the professionals that I would go to see to talk about, to try to find out what was happening, is they would say that people who are bipolar turn their rage onto the people who are closest to them. So I remember when we talked, you had a pretty good explanation for why that is.
Absolutely. And so I'll finish so we'll come back. Don't let me forget that. So I'll finish the chain. So now people are their amygdala's activated. They're in this irrational place. Okay. It's when they need the Band-Aid or the pain medication, which is drinking, drug. I mean, there's many, but I mean, it's the no choice choices we talked about in the podcast. It's the things that people do to relieve their emotional distress because they work. So sometimes it's alcohol, sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's promiscuous behavior in terms of seeking validation from others. It might be self-harming behavior, talk of suicide. It might be a spending, wild projects. Now this is where it starts to look like bipolar. Now you listen to the things that I say. What do we say about people who are in a manic bipolar state? We say they're irrational. We say they're impulsive. Mm-hmm. We say they have all this energy. They are maybe running around in relationships. They're spending. They're making these bad decisions. Kind of sounds like emotional dysregulation to me. So we see how, if you're looking at this through a medical lens, things start to line up, and yet they don't. Because what we know, what I know and what many people know is that you can become irrational, what looks like psychotic or manic in that state of extreme distress. So just moving forward now. So the coping strategies that people develop is what causes the most impact on one's life. It causes the chaotic relationship. It causes job loss. It causes, poor choices that make you feel bad, even more bad about yourself because you've maybe used drugs or you've slept with somebody or you've had an affair. Like it just causes more self-esteem issues the more poor choices you make to relieve your distress. So that's kind of the cycle, right?
Okay, so you're saying that because the depression that she felt, and I'm sure that many people have felt, I mean, obviously many people have felt, was like basically soul crushing. It was horrific, right?
Absolutely. But if you have, but think about this for a minute, and this is where we have to have compassion, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think, and I look at this situation and I think, anybody who had a horrific childhood, who didn't feel good about themselves, had not learned to love themselves, had all of that unresolved grief and pain around that, would you be happy? Because I think I feel like shit too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, that's normal. That's being human.
Amazing.
And unfortunately, and this is the sad part, is that nobody helped her acknowledge that and work through that pain. Instead, we called it broken. We talked about this, on our call. We call it broken. We call it illness. And what happens for people like Cindy is they become more and more despondent, because the more we try to treat the illness and give medication and, do the whole, whether it's the bipolar treatment or the antidepressant regime, and we follow that and it doesn't work, we feel more hopeless. And that kind of adds to our despair.
Okay, so that's really, I just find that really fascinating. So we had
the part about hurting people that are the closest.
Oh, yes.
So for people who have attachment insecurity, is the reason, and it isn't that simple. I mean, we could say and I almost don't like that, so I'm going to challenge that. And I hear it all the time, and I don't think that doctor who said that was malicious in saying that, but when you say it like that, it sounds like Cindy was willfully hurting you. Like, it kind of sounds like, that was, she's hurting you because you're the closest to her and that's safe. But it isn't that at all. She was making choices that was, it was hurting herself more than anyone, because she didn't know any other way. But the reason that people, that you were the target is because you had become, as her husband, her primary secure attachment. So when she was little, parents or maybe mom would have been the primary figure, right? Now that relationship was, didn't meet her needs. Now she's insecure in relationships. The person who is supposed to be the closest, so husband, before we partner, it's our parents, usually our mother. But when that person doesn't meet our needs, not through any fault of your own, but how would you know what her needs are? When you don't meet her needs, or when you say the wrong thing, look the wrong way, question, the hurt is deeper for her, because you, of all people, as my husband, should know me and love me enough to have not said that, or to have done that differently, or to have supported me better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
She is more hurt by what you do by default because you're the closest. It doesn't mean she's hurting you intentionally. It just means that you activate her insecurity the most. And when her insecurity is activated, that's when her, those no choice choices or that maladaptive coping kicks in. And so it's you because you're the offender, and you're the offender because you're the closest to her.
Interesting. Yeah, I never had anybody. The way you initially said it, or how it's typically looked at, was that she's doing it because it's safe. That's how it was actually explained to me. So,
but it's not true. It's not true at all. It's actually unsafe. She's acting out because she doesn't feel safe. Because when she didn't feel, and it's not, and this isn't about you. It's not that you didn't make her feel loved or you didn't make her feel safe. She doesn't feel loved and safe because she's had attachment trauma. She didn't feel secure in herself. So whenever that security was challenged, even if it was her own behavior, so say she had yelled at you and called you every name in the book, and rightfully so, maybe you said, I need a break, I'm going to go to my room. Now that's logical and reasonable, and you shouldn't have done anything different, but she is going to feel abandoned. Because you, of all people, as my husband, if you love me, you should know, and this is subconscious, you should have known that what I really need for you right now is to hug me and tell me you're not leaving.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, that dynamic would have been, like, there were times when I did things that were, I don't want to say legitimately hurtful, because to her, I mean, I guess in her view, the things that hurt, right? But there was things I did that were pretty horrible. So, I mean, that would have been, I would suspect the impact would have been multiplied. even
Sure.
more. So, okay, so on that, so now we've been talking specifically, illustrating these points through talking about Cindy's story and label of bipolar and all that, which I think is interesting. But this idea, this notion covers, all kinds of different things we label as mental illness, from depression, anxiety, to obsessive compulsive disorder, to probably post-traumatic stress in some way. So how is it that somebody manifest symptoms as depression? I mean, how does that work? Or, somebody looks like they might be bipolar, and somebody looks like they have anxiety, and some people look like they have depression. Like, how does that all work together?
So I'm just trying to suss out the question there.
So the question is, so some people will say, I have depression. Some people will say, I deal with anxiety. Some people will say, I'm bipolar. And
because that's the words that in our society we know. We connect with the symptoms or the feelings we're experiencing. We connect them with those words because that's what we know. And so I'm going to kind of get a little abstract here. And we talked about this last time, but for the sake of this interview, not every place in the world uses those words or sees it in that way.
Right.
So here, because we kind of define certain symptoms as mental illness and we have words for them like anxiety, depression, then when somebody experiences, say, sadness or fear or unrest, unsettled, we call that the words that we know, that we hear in the media, in society, from our doctors. So we say, oh, I'm anxious, right? Well, really, what is anxiety? Anxiety is based in fear. Mm-hmm. What is fear? Fear is a normal human reaction. So, but we have these words to call it. So I might say a more kinder way to look at, if I was experiencing something that maybe a doctor would call anxiety, how I choose to look at that and the lens that I use is a more compassionate way of even looking at myself. I might say, I'm scared about, whether or not, my job is in jeopardy, and my body, is telling me I'm scared by having this knot in my stomach and I'm not sleeping and do you see the difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So that makes total sense. So I guess I think what I'm trying to get at is, what is it about people's either individual makeup or their experiences, the traumas they face or whatever, that causes some people to have symptoms that look like depression, and other people to have symptoms so not everybody is promiscuous and spends all kinds of money and does the things that a bipolar bipolar person does. So how do people take their experiences, these traumas, and then manifest them in different ways? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and it's an interplay of a couple things. So it's an interplay of who we are as a person and how we're made and what our experiences actually were. And so that's how it gets manifested in different ways. So in Cindy's case, she had, her, to simplify it, she might have had a little bit of emotional vulnerability. She might have been sensitive. She had wildly invalidating experiences that were, related to attachment insecurity, which caused her to have sort of this low self-esteem, which caused her to be emotional when she perceived hurt and abandonment. And then her particular coping strategies might have been like A, B, and C that were unhealthy. Mm-hmm. Now, looking at a different situation, it might have manifested differently. So we could have a different person born a different way who might have had less trauma, but they might have been more sensitive. And so they could have ended up with some of the same behaviors. Now, when we get into things like, okay, so we're talking about, something that may look like what Cindy had. So just other common things like OCD. I'll talk about OCD for a minute. What is obsessive compulsive disorder? It's when we have an obsessive thought and there's some compulsive behavior that we repeat to try to relieve the irrational fear or the stress. So again, what is the driving factor in OCD? It's fear. It's a rational fear, but it's still fear. What is fear? Fear is a normal human reaction. So what drives OCD? Fear. Fear, which causes an obsessive worry, which manifests as an anxiety in the body, a physical manifestation, which causes us to want to ease our pain and discomfort by doing some ritualistic behavior that really kind of, is designed to relieve our distress. So if we're afraid of getting sick by a germ, that's fear. We compulsively think about that over and over and over again. We can't let go. We can't move past it. We get stuck. And so the compulsive behavior of washing our hands over and over again is to relieve the distress of the fear of getting sick. That make sense?
That makes sense.
So that is understandable, and that's sort of a normal human reaction. Now, in the extreme, when it goes outside that box of what we can kind of say, oh, well, that makes sense, that's normal or typical, when it goes outside that box and it becomes too much of a reaction, that's when we call it OCD.
Okay.
Or when we call it anxiety, or when we call it some mental illness.
So what do you say, that all makes sense to me. So what do you say to the person that says, I hear guys say this sometimes, and they'll say, yeah, fuck man, I had a good life, and then all of a sudden when I was 18 years old, my life took a shit. I got depressed, and now they're on medication, and the way they're describing the story is that they didn't have the traumatic experiences that you're talking about are sort of required, quote, required to lead to this. So what is that? Do people think that? I mean, I've heard people say it.
Yeah. So absolutely. So perception is important, and sometimes habit, right? So if we start to be in the habit of thinking negatively about situations, we start to, it becomes ingrained in our personality. So you ever meet somebody who has elements of their personality that causes problems in their life? Oh. Whether it be that they're too critical of others, whether it be that they're never take a risk or try anything new because they're a nervous Nelly, or do you know what I mean? Like there's just elements of their personality that aren't really helpful.
Brian Noller, who's not on this call, exhibits all of that. You, Brian, I'm calling you out. No, I'm kidding. No. Yes, I definitely, we all know people like that.
Okay, so we all know people like that. So it's elements of our personality. So I think when it comes to how we see and perceive our lives and our world and what it means to us, sometimes we get in a habit of looking at that a certain way.
Okay.
And repeated enough over time, it starts to become ingrained, like it starts to become how we think, and then that affects how we relate to the world. So if I always think that, I'm just trying to think of a negative belief system. So if I think I'm,
I'm
I'm not smart, or if I think the world is, a hard, cruel place, or if I believe that, people don't really get me, it starts to cloud.
I'm no good in crowds. I'm no good around people.
Yeah, we have these negative messages that play in our head that start, so then we believe. So we say, okay, well, things took a shitter, and from then on, everything else was, nothing else went right. Well, if you start to, believe that nothing's going to go right, then you don't, then you lower your expectations, and then guess what? Your life's not as great. And it just perpetuates.
Interesting. So your point is that, regardless of, in order to heal going forward, you gotta dig into the past a little bit. Because one of the things I hear people say, and I don't know what your thoughts on this are, but I've heard counselors say that recently, so for example, you're in this state right now where you're manifesting these, you have these symptoms or you're behaving in this way, and you're not supposed to, from what I understand, you're not supposed to go back and relive the past anymore, right? Because that's just reliving that trauma.
Re-traumatizing, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you, I mean, you as a mental health coach and somebody how do you help people move forward but you got to understand the past, but without reliving it? How do you do that?
Yeah. So there's people who can tolerate different, and that's why there's different modalities, there's different supports, there's different ways of looking at this, but everybody needs something different. So there are people that for whom unpacking every single detail of their tortured lives will be too traumatic or will be not serve a purpose. It won't be helpful. There's people who need that. There's people who can tolerate that a little bit. There's people whose ways of thinking and habits aren't so ingrained that you can do it a little bit, but then that's enough that they understand themselves and get enough insight that they can make some positive changes. It's all different.
Right.
It's all different. And there are people, I'll tell you that there are people that I've met that I would say certain kinds of therapies are counterproductive. So again, using Cindy as an example, for her to have done something like psychoanalytic, psychodynamic psychotherapy would have been counterproductive. Because there isn't enough validation and feedback given by that type of clinician, it would have been rejecting for her. So there are certain modalities for certain kind of people that are more effective. For somebody like Cindy, the treatment of choice would have been something like dialectical behavior therapy that is very warm, compassionate, empathic, and validating, because she would have needed that acceptance, radical acceptance from her therapist to be able to take a risk to actually, make changes, to confront.
So what does that mean, dialectical?
So dialectical behavior therapy is a type of therapy that was created for people who, and like Cindy, I told you this when you were in my office, that I thought, that she kind of met that criteria of somebody who, was kind of, moving through her life being affected by some of that attachment trauma. So for people like that, you have to, therapy has to be in a certain way that, like I just said, is very accepting and empathic and validating, because they have not been validated. Their sense of self is fractured. So anything that pushes for change too quickly is going to threaten them, and they're not going to be able to do it. So in dialectical behavior therapy, so the dialectic is two opposing ideas at the same time. And in dialectical behavior therapy, it's holding acceptance and change at the same time. And those two ideas are opposite, because either you accept something or you want to change it, right? Mm-hmm. But holding acceptance and change at the same time for somebody who's emotionally sensitive and insecure is very important, because they can't change unless they have that accepting environment. And that dialectic transcends through the whole model, even in terms of how they view themselves. So I need to accept and have compassion for myself and my choices and everything that's happened in my life in order to be able to change. It's the way that the therapist interacts with them. So it kind of transcends everything. So that would be the treatment of choice for somebody who has those symptoms. Now, for somebody who has some other symptoms, there's different things that will be helpful. But there's no kind of one therapy fits all. But what I do know, and what I think is the key here, is that the more insight we have into what drives our emotions, the more in touch we get with that, the more helpful it is in terms of making changes and moving forward.
Okay.
So accepting, facing our vulnerability, accepting, what's happening, and looking at, what's the common denominator here is ourselves, right? So kind of being faced with that and being able to look at that is always helpful. It's always helpful.
Okay, so just lastly on the sort of the modalities. I mean, one of the things that, and then I want to get into, I think what's going to be a topic people find super interesting. But Cindy went through behavior modification therapy, which even at the time I thought was basically saying, like, the shit you're doing is fucked up, do something else instead.
And I told you that is the worst treatment for somebody who has these attachment insecurities. Worst.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. So, yeah. So I think that's a really good insight, though, is that you need to look at the whole human being to understand what the type, like not just the symptoms, but the type of person they are and how emotionally resilient they are and the experiences that they've had to determine, which obviously makes sense, but to give them the unique experiences and treatment that they need to help themselves move forward. Everybody's unique, right? And it's really awesome in a way to hear you say that, because that's so true in all. I mean, we are unique. We all look at the world our own way. We all have our own dreams. We all have our own beliefs. We all have our own, view of ourselves, like all of these things. So to try this idea that, you're this, this one very superficial label, that, so therefore the path forward for you is, you're X and the path forward for you is Y, and that's just how it works. There's always a connection between those two things.
Absolutely. And Jason, isn't that what our medical model does? Like when we look at this as illness, it's so, like I get frustrated. And I know I've shared that, you've heard me share my frustration before, but when we call it when we label something as a diagnosis, then people get pigeonholed into that treatment. And it does not take into account the individuality of the person. And so it's such a disservice. So when I say to somebody, you have, schizophrenia, you're manic, you're anxious, you're depressed, you have bipolar, you have OCD, then all of a sudden now we're being given the treatment for that disorder, and it may not meet your particular individual needs. And so it's frustrating, I've said it before, the disempowerment, it's disempowering. It takes the power to heal thyself away from the patient when we make it an illness, and it turns that power over to the doctor. And I believe even if it's what we traditionally call mental illness, or if it's what I call it, which is emotional distress, regardless of what we call it, it doesn't matter. People have the ability to overcome this. And that key lies within themselves, not in some doctor's office. And it's no disrespect to all of the clinicians out there, but, I think people need to know, people who are listening need to know there is something you can do about this and feel better and live a better life.
Well, and I think you're right. And I think it fits so neatly into the overall model, like better living through science. Mm-hmm. You're going to have the government. They're going to tell you what kind of foods you should eat. They're going to make this ridiculous food pyramid. You're going to eat those foods. Then you're going to get fucking sick. So then you're going to, because it's not the way, there is no one way to eat for everybody. And then you eat that way and you get sick. And then you're going to get prescribed medication by somebody that's way smarter than you to help manage the symptoms, because it's not your fault. This is just, mm-hmm. You're doing all the things you're supposed to do, or, you don't have any ownership over your own self to change your behavior, and so we're going to prescribe these medications, and this is how so people they become diabetic, and they have high, heart disease and all of these things that are like Western diseases. And then, so when we look at it from an emotional standpoint, that fits right perfectly into that model. So mm-hmm. It's not a stretch to say that, as much as somebody, like, I'll give you an example. So my mother has diabetes, right? So basically mm-hmm. the recommendation of the Diabetes Association is just eat the same shit that gave you diabetes, but eat less of it. Basically. I mean, that's obviously oversimplifying it, but that's kind of the gist of it, right? Eat the food pyramid, but just eat less of it. So that, I think it's not a leap for people to say, yeah, this is the way forward. This is not, quote, curable. I got to manage this. And the way to manage it is by listening to a smart person tell me what to do.
And right? We put all our trust in faith because we've been conditioned all our lives to believe that they're the experts.
Right.
And
right.
and so if we look at this through the emotional lens versus mental illness, is that who is the expert in our emotions and how we feel inside? It's us, right? It's not some doctor. And I'm not trying to slam doctors, but I just think that model doesn't work when it comes to emotional distress. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, no, amazing. That's just so, I love it. So, okay, so one thing you alluded to, I think this is going to be a really interesting point. It was impactful on the call we just had, and I think some people are going to go, what the fuck are you talking about? and that is the idea of no choice choices. So can we touch on that?
Sure. There's a lot of things that people do that, we think we might have some judgment about. Okay, so people use drugs, they drink, they, spend, they, quit a good job, they break up with person kind of in the heat of a moment, and then you can say we have some judgment about that because we say, well, why did you do that? How could you have done that? How could you have gone back to drinking? Or how could you have cheated on your husband? Or how could you have, made that decision? Like, you should have known better, right? And those choices that people make are seen as behavior or poor judgment, right? So the idea of no choice choices is, I think, a more compassionate way of looking at some of the ways that people manage their emotional pain. And so in the call that we did, I talked about being human, and as humans, we are driven to ease our pain, to take our pain away, because as humans, again, we can't live with pain. So we kind of understand that. So, we understand that when it comes to physical pain. So we get it. Somebody has a migraine and they take a Tylenol. We don't judge them for that, right? Oh, you had a headache. So of course you're going to take medication for that. But we judge people when it comes to the choices that they make with managing their emotional pain. And what I challenge people to think about is that it's no different when we are in extreme emotional pain because we feel hurt, unloved, judged, abandoned, any of the above. So we are having some emotional distress. As humans, we can't walk around with that. We can't just do nothing about that. Just like we couldn't lay in bed with a migraine knowing there's Tylenol in the cupboard and not get up and take one. Or, the example I use of, you wouldn't burn your hand and not go run it under cold water. Of course you would. So if you're having emotional distress and you're in a high level of emotional pain, why do we judge people who reach for the bottle or who maybe cut themselves to have a physical pain to take away from the emotional one? We say, oh, well, that was a really bad choice. And so the idea of no choice choices is a more compassionate way to look at that. Because if we accept that people are in pain and that they need a way to manage it and they are going to reach to the most accessible thing that works, is that we can be less judgmental about that.
And I think the initial response to that for some people, and there's even a part of me that thinks it, is if that's the case, then when do people ever have to own their choices? You know what I mean?
Right. Oh, and it doesn't absolve. And so it's not absolving people of responsibility for their choices. It's not saying that then the outcome or the consequence for that bad choice isn't theirs. It's not making excuses for people. It's just being able to have empathy and compassion for people.
Okay. So, because this idea is so eye-opening for me. So for me, I went through, the trauma of Cindy's death and her illness and all these, I don't want to call them micro traumas, but just a series of very traumatic things that happened. And so I started drinking really heavily. And one thing that, I, as a, rational, logical person, I couldn't, there was so much of me that hated that I was doing this thing that was obviously fucking illogical. It was obviously harming myself. I was obviously hurting the people around me. And I could not, and I would beat the shit out of myself for not being able to stop. And there was times where I wanted to stop more than I've ever wanted anything else. There was times I'd be in this room I'm standing in when no one was home, screaming at myself, out loud, to stop. And I couldn't fucking stop. And I'm thinking to myself, why can't I stop? Why can't, why?
Well, because you had no other mechanism to manage that pain that you're feeling from all of the experiences that you had had.
That's right. And I didn't even know. I wasn't even consciously aware that I was experiencing the pain because I was numbing it, right?
Yeah.
And then when I quit, I had this emotional experience of my daughter telling me that, she was disappointed in me or whatever. And then I quit. And I remember saying to Tanya, I have no fucking clue why I quit this time. Okay, that was a traumatic, her telling me that was disappointing. And I've told all these stories around, I got vulnerable with myself and blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, I have no fucking clue, actually, why I was able to quit at that time. I don't have a clue, and it's really weird and unsettling to not know that.
Well, and so, I can give you some options. I mean,
Sure.
I don't know, but sometimes we start to heal. I mean, it's possible that you were starting to heal and you were at a place where maybe,
Could be.
Subconsciously you might have been ready to grieve. Like, and I'm going to make an assumption and I don't know, and you can call me out if I'm really wrong, but like, since you quit drinking, have you now been going through the process of grieving that you stuck down with the alcohol?
Absolutely.
Because it was still there, right? It was still there. It wasn't gone. You were numbing and you were keeping it down. And sometimes we do that because we don't feel like, and this is all subconscious, we aren't ready because we think if I feel that, I'm going to go into this pit of despair and never get out. So we don't.
Or if I feel it, I think the narrative I told myself is if I feel it, I'm weak. Right?
Sure.
And I'm not weak.
So we just muscle through. But at some point in time, for whatever reason, maybe because you were ready or maybe because the pain had eased enough that you could bear it or face it. I don't know why.
Yeah, sure.
But when you stop numbing, guess what? That grief was still there.
It was there 5 years.
Still had to go through that process, right?
And so that brings up an interesting point is when you have, what role, this is such a good conversation. I've never thought about a lot of this stuff, even though we've talked about it, but what role does grief play in the healing process of someone? So somebody experiences trauma, they're manifesting these symptoms. What role does grief play in healing that?
Grief is huge. Dealing with grief is huge. So we have to grieve the lost innocence of that little girl who wasn't protected and got abused. I mean, not but I mean, people who have experienced trauma have to grieve for themselves. So you had to grieve for Cindy's death, but she, in her work, in her recovery, would have been, somebody might have helped her grieve that little girl who was hurt. Grief for that little girl who was hurt.
And she tried to, I always describe it as like these demons were chasing her and she's tried to outrun them instead of confronting them. You know what I mean? Like okay, I know we were going a little long here, so I just
yeah. So, is there sort of an important or pressing?
Well, I guess what I wanted to maybe what we could wrap up with, and I think this really ties into the idea of compassion that we talked about, but maybe we could talk about the very small box of normal that's constructed in our society and how that kind of contributes to what we're talking about and how other people look at that differently. Because I think it's that there's a lot of compassion, but the bigger the box, the more compassion there is.
Oh, absolutely. And so you said it, in our society, we have this very narrow-minded or small box of what is normal. And so when people's emotions or reactions or behaviors or coping mechanisms fall outside of that very small box that, in North America we call normal, then society feels like, oh, we need to, stick a label on that, send people to a program, change it, quick fix it. And we don't allow people the luxury to kind of be in pain, be sad, be unproductive, be isolated and work through that. And so that, like you said, that box is very small here. And in other places, there is either a bigger box or guess what, Jason, there's no box. Mm-hmm. Right? So what is normal? There is no normal. Normal is whatever the society you live in defines as normal, right? Because that doesn't exist. Everybody is different. So my normal is different than your normal is different than anybody else's normal.
Yeah, but such an important.
So we can't really define that. And so we can be more compassionate when we stop trying to look at, how people feel and how people manage how they feel, as being sort of atypical or broken or needing changing or needing fixing. And because when we do that, when society does that, it causes this situation where then people do it to themselves. So people start to define themselves and criticize themselves and berate themselves for being out of some box.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
and I think, compassion in this scenario is twofold. We need to be more compassionate and kind to ourselves, and we need more compassion and kindness from the people who are in supportive roles in our community.
Yeah, that's
from others and for each other, right?
yeah.
My girlfriend and I, and so we both have had similar experiences in our childhood, and we've had similar experiences in our marriages, and we have become very compassionate of one another. So I am not afraid to tell her when I've made a no choice that wasn't so great, because I know she won't judge me, and as I experience that lack of judgment from her and that acceptance from her, I'm able to, have it for myself, and vice versa. I have it for her. She has it for me, and that's helpful to people. It's helpful to people. I can say to my best friend, I drank a bottle of wine last night because I was sad because some stupid boy didn't text me. You know what I mean? And she can say genuinely, well, of course you'd be sad, and what else would you have done? And then then I feel like I don't have to beat myself up about that, and then I can move on and do something differently tomorrow. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And it's funny because one of the things I tell people a lot, and this conversation is really making me realize that this is even more impactful than I thought. But I often tell people, like, when you're talking about a mental or emotional health issue, and somebody's struggling, you don't necessarily need another program or a process or a policy document or a committee, but what you need is for you to realize that somebody is struggling and look them in the eye and say, I struggle too, and if you ever want to talk, I will not judge you. And this conversation has made me realize, I knew it was powerful, but I feel like this conversation has really driven home how powerful a gesture like that could really be. I really believe it's one of the greatest gifts that one human being can give to another, which is just a safe place and a lack of judgment.
Oh, absolutely, because if somebody says to you, or if so I'll just do, in addictions, and this is sort of that change model. Somebody says to you, I'm drinking every night. The first response usually that people would have would be, you should go to AA.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying it, and this isn't a bash on AA. You should call Thames Valley Addiction Center. You should get some help for that. What we need to say, and so I'm not saying, I'm not perfect, but I mean, what I would say in that situation is, what is causing you so much pain that you need to drink every night?
Yeah.
Not go fix that, right? Oh, go fix that. Stop doing that. No. What's causing you to have to do that? Like how are you suffering? Because until we heal the suffering, we're not going to change the medicating behavior.
Absolutely. Okay, well, listen, I have one more question, and it isn't really a question. I just want you to describe this moment to me, because I know that you've had them with the people that you work with. What does it mean for somebody when you look them in the eye and you tell them, you're not mentally ill, you're soft-hearted, or you're broken-hearted? What does that mean to them?
I think it's relief. I don't know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that, but I can tell you what it feels like for me when I say that. What I perceive as the reaction is I see relief. I see people just let go, let go of some defensiveness, let go of some, and I'll give you an example. I'm an example that, like, I kind of draw from my experiences. And so if I can tell you an example. So a couple years ago now, I had these parents come to me in absolute desperation to get help for their son. And he was about, I want to say maybe 21 at the time. And how they described the situation to me is that, he had a huge fight with his girlfriend. He had lost control. He had, acted out in some way. She had called the police. In that chaos, he had cut his arms. He had threatened suicide and cut up his arms. and was taken to jail by the police. And through all that process, the court had said he had to go and get a psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatrist had said, yeah, you have a mental illness. I can't even remember at the time what it was. But yeah, you have a mental illness. Take this medicine. And his parents were absolutely distraught because he wouldn't take the medicine, wouldn't go back to see the psychiatrist, and was kind of refuting this, or rejecting this notion of whatever the mental illness was that they diagnosed him with. And they were absolutely distraught because they believed that if he didn't engage with the psychiatrist and take the treatment, that he was doomed to this life, this life that he kind of had found himself in, taking his own life, or, acting out, getting in trouble. And so they just said, please help. And so he he agreed. So he was court ordered because of the charges that he had to, part of the court order was he had to receive counseling. So he really had no choice, right? If he wanted to fulfill the obligations of the probation and stay out of trouble and stay out of jail, he had to see a counselor. And so they came to me, and he came to see me. And I listened to his story, and this is a good kid. He's the nicest young man, and what I learned about him is that he loves big, and he is sensitive, and he fell in love, and it was kind of a sort of a tumultuous relationship. She had some attachment issues. He had low self-esteem, and they had this very romantic kind of love. And when it was over, in the emotional dysregulated state of this relationship being over, yes, he had, pushed the door. And I'm not making excuses,
Sure.
But, had lost control, had kind of pushed on the door and scared her, and he had cut himself, and all that was true. But in that craziness, what looked like craziness, he was just experiencing this intense emotional pain. And he was losing his love, right? This story. And so at the end of the story, so he tells me what happened, and it was one of those moments where I looked at him and I said, you don't have a mental illness. I said, you have a big heart, and, your heart was broken. And so when I put it, and that relief, or that, that bravado. So he came in sort of defending himself against this idea that he was sick. And when I gave him permission that he didn't have to buy into that, it was just relief. And we've worked together for 2 years, and I think it's amazing in itself, in the sense of what young man in his early 20s would kind of openly admit to liking to go to counseling for 2 years. But we had a conversation recently sort of about the process of counseling and moving forward, and how much work he'd done. And he's in such a good place now. And he's learning about himself and the kind of relationship he wants, and how to pick a partner that is good for him, that isn't going to evoke some of those intense emotions. And he's just so insightful and so motivated to have a good life. And we were talking about his friends, because he's a young man, and I said, just out of curiosity, because he has a roommate, I said, where do you say you go every other Monday at 7 o'clock? Because he's got buddies that he lives with, right? Mm-hmm. He says, oh no, he says, I tell them I'm going to my counseling. He says, my roommates know this is where I go every other Monday, and that, even sometimes, when they have stuff going on in their life, I tell them they should go to counseling. And what a difference from, he won't go to the psychiatrist and take medication, to this is really helpful, and I tell people, I tell other people they should do it too. And that's the power of acceptance.
And that is an amazing place to end it. So listen, I am so grateful. You know what? I'm so grateful for you coming on. I think this is such an important conversation, and it feels so good that we can play a part in, stimulating that conversation. So, and I feel like I could talk to you for 10 more hours. So I have one question. Is, would you ever be willing to come on again?
Yes. And and just because I work a lot. Yep. I mean, that's no big surprise. I work a lot, and I'm sort of managing a full-time job and my own business. So I do probably work about 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So, for me, the issue is always time. So with enough planning and enough notice, I would be happy to work that in.
Wonderful. And I guess the next thing is, and the last thing is, I think there's going to be a lot of people that want to talk to you as a result of this. And I know that you do, we talked about the mental health coaching you do. You're going to be offering online coaching for people that aren't in the geographic area. And I think that would be a huge, huge service to our listeners. And, as more people find out about you, I think that's just a wonderful way to expand your reach and just help people who need you. So what is the best way for people to get a hold of you?
The best way, and so for those in London, I do have an office in a wellness center in London, Ontario, and if people are out of the catchment area or for whatever reason are stuck in their home, I am going to be doing the Skype, like you said, some work over Skype or phone. I've been doing phone, but I'm going to experiment with Skype. And my website is my name, so it's sabrinaandrews.ca with no period in my name, just all one word, sabrinaandrews.ca. And there's a link to my email address on the website, but it is hope, the word hope, at sabrinaandrews.ca. And that's how people can reach me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
This conversation has really opened my eyes around emotional health and how our emotions drive our behavior. And it's really caused me to rethink Cindy's diagnosis of bipolar disorder and how things could have been different for her and for us and for our family. And for that, I'm really grateful to Sabrina, and I really, really valued and enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you did as well. For information on how to contact Sabrina, you can check the show notes page at mentalhealthwarriors.com/004. And I want to leave with the message that I always tell people. If you're struggling, I've struggled too. And if you ever want to talk, I want you to know, and I promise that I will not judge you. No one needs to go through this alone, and we are stronger together. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into this week's show, and for more episodes and resources, head on over to mentalhealthwarriors.com.